Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Well, this year's budget is not the horror budget of last year. That was in a league all its own. It was so bad indeed that I, along with one other member of the House of Representatives, felt the need to vote against Appropriation Bills 1 and 2, in effect to attempt to block supply, because we thought it was important that the government last year went back to the drawing board and redid last year's budget and made it fairer. Regrettably, that was not to be the case because the Labor Party and the Greens voted for supply in that case. But that brings me to this year's budget. It's a mixed bag, Deputy Speaker, but on balance I am concerned, though, that it's still not unfair, that it's not sensibly funded, and it contains very little joy for Tasmania. There is some good news, and I should acknowledge that and applaud the government for that good news. The government's decision not to go ahead with the changes to the indexation of the age pension is a good decision. Mind you, it's a reversal of a bad decision last year. It was always madness, Deputy Speaker, to change the indexation of the age pension, which would have resulted in diminished spending power for aged pensioners over time. Regrettably, the age pension is inadequate as it is. There was no sense at all in diminishing the buying power over time. This year's budget did contain a very welcome boost for small business, and that has been very well received in Tasmania, not least because small business really is the backbone of the Tasmanian economy. The childcare boost, that's also welcome. We clearly should do whatever we can to assist people to get back into the workforce, but we should also, Deputy Speaker, do everything we can to improve the education of our youngsters. And I am persuaded that early childhood education is, on balance, good for boys and girls. It's certainly been my experience with my own two little daughters that they benefited greatly from early childhood education. And I was very pleased to see in the budget, Deputy Speaker, funding confirmed for the Hobart Airport runway extension, and also the remaining money towards the rebuild of the Royal Hobart Hospital, which is now going ahead and desperately needed. But, Deputy Speaker, I've given credit where it's due to the government. I'll now focus on areas of great concern. And I think the budget is still unfair. It is still unfair. And it's very helpful to look at the ACOS assessment of the report, which also highlights the fact that this year's budget fails the fairness test. And in fact, ACOS identifies that when you combine the 2014 budget savings measures with the 2015 budget savings measures, that there has effectively been a $15 billion cut over the budget and forward estimates from basic services and support. And that's before you add the $80 billion cut to health and education over the next 10 years. Is that fair? Is it necessary? Well, I don't think so, Deputy Speaker. The fact is we live in a very rich and lucky country. The federal budget in any one year is in the order of $400,000 million. Surely, with good politicians making good decisions, we can look after adequately the people that need to be looked after. We can look after the very young. We can look after students, the unemployed, the sick, the disabled, the aged. It's all about priorities. And to cut $15 billion out of the coming financial year and the following 3 years of forward estimates, to cut $80 billion out of health and education over the next 10 years, it is not necessary. There is enough money in the federal budget to look after people that need looking after. It's as simple as that. In fact, ACOS goes on to identify the combined impact of the two budgets to include things such as the $126 million cut from child dental programs, $1 billion cut in health funding, $6 billion in cuts to family payments, $1 billion in cuts to vital community services, $500 million cut from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander services and programs, $674 million to be cut from affordable housing and homelessness programs. I could go on. Deputy Speaker, yes, we do need to restructure the budget because we do need to balance it over the long term. The question is, how do we do it? And we don't need to cut in those places. And I will offer some comments about how we might afford the budget in the future in a little while. There's a few things that really jump out at me, Deputy Speaker, really jump out. For example, the government's determination to cut family tax benefit Part B. Deputy Speaker, this will hammer low-income families and be very, very problematic for single parents. Why do we go after these people? Why do we go after mainly single mums on low incomes? Their children have just turned 6, they're in school. Why do we go after them for budget savings? Surely single mums with young kids are just the sort of people that we should be looking after well in this country. And it's not good enough to say that their kids are 6 or 7 or 8 or 9, so the single mum can go go to work, can rejoin the workforce. Because when you drop the children off at 9 and you've got to pick them up at 3, and you've got travel time as well to and from work, it is very hard to get a well-paying job, a decent employer who will employ you between 9:30 or 10 in the morning and 2 or 2:30 in the afternoon. It's hard for these single mums. So, I urge the government again to retreat from this determination to cut family tax benefit Part B. It's not fair. So too, it's not fair, the change in the assets for older Australians who are on a part pension. I believe there need to be changes to make the budget affordable, but by reducing the assets that a part pensioner can have while still receiving a part-age pension, they've cut too far. Because the reality is we live in a very soft economic time. Many aged pensioners or partly self-funded retirees have conservative investments. You might only be getting a few percent interest from the bank on your investment or another form of investment. So they've cut too far, and it is forcing, or it will force, these people to draw down their savings too fast. And you get these perverse outcomes, Deputy Speaker. I'll quote Jennifer Hewitt from the Financial Review earlier in the week, and she gives an example. Those with $600,000 in savings would get a part pension as well as investment income. The combination of both for the people with $600 in assets would be roughly equivalent to getting the full pension the combination of both would be roughly equivalent to just getting the full pension of over $34,000. But in contrast, if those people had only $375,000 in savings, they could get a full pension plus investment income, making almost $45,000 in annual income. So I think those exact settings have been ill-considered, Deputy Speaker. And what about this whole business about double dipping? Well, let's not forget, there's 80,000 mums out there, or would-be mums out there, who have forsaken income rises to have workplace paid parental leave arrangements. This isn't double dipping. These are people that have negotiated this additional paid parental leave benefit, and the government now wants to take it off them. Overseas aid, Deputy Speaker. John Howard, to his credit, not something I've said too often, but John Howard, to his credit, 15 years ago, committed Australia to the Millennium Goal of 0.7% of gross national income in foreign development aid. At the moment, it's under a half of that, and with the cuts that in this budget, by fiscal 16-17, it will be down to 0.22% of gross national income in foreign development aid, less than 1/3 what John Howard committed to 15 years ago. A cut, Deputy Speaker, that is not ethical, and it's not in Australia's best interest. Our best interest is served by helping countries in our region to be stable and prosperous and to be developed. That will foster security, that will open up markets. Deputy Speaker, I've made the point already that I don't think this budget is sensibly funded. The preoccupation of the government in this budget and in last year's budget is all about savings, and there's very little attention to the imperative to increase revenue. So where is the government's interest in superannuation reform? Frankly, Deputy Speaker, rich people don't need a tax break on super. And where's the interest in finally taxing companies who make super profits? Where's the interest in taxing them effectively? You know, the banks, for example, they make super profits. Well, why don't we make them pay a bit more tax? These are the sort of areas that this government or a future government should be considering to increase revenue, because that's the real problem with our federal budget at the moment, is a revenue shortfall. So stop cutting the people that can least afford it and go after the people that can afford to pay a bit more tax. Deputy Speaker, little joy for Tasmania in this budget. Of course, everything that hurts Australians broadly hurts Tasmanians more, because we have a relatively disadvantaged community. We have a higher unemployment rate, we have lower average incomes, we have the added cost of Bass Strait. So everything in this budget that hurts mainlanders hurts Tasmanians more. And we will be hurt just as much as everyone else by the $80 billion cut in health and education spending. That's going to take about $2 billion out of the Tasmanian budget over the next 10 years. But we have a very small tax base. We have less flexibility in our economy. We have less capacity to deal with these cutbacks. And if we think the cutbacks in last year and this year are bad, wait till we see the effects over the next 10 years of the $80 billion cut in federal funding for health and education, including the $2 billion cut in Tasmania. Disappointed also, Deputy Speaker, to see that only half the money is being provided for Tasmania than was promised for our rail upgrade. We were promised $120 million of federal assistance for our railway upgrade, and this budget contains a little under $60 million. Yes, the state government is recklessly cutting back on their contribution, but I think it would be entirely appropriate for the federal government to deliver on its promise. And I'd like to see the federal government do more than show interest in the University of Tasmania's $400 million deep restructure. That's the sort of federal assistance that the budget should include, because that's exactly the sort of federal assistance that will help Tasmania grow and be less reliant on federal assistance in the future. Tasmania receives a disproportionate amount of money from Canberra for welfare. We receive a disproportionate amount of money in special purpose payments from Canberra because of all the disadvantages we have in our community. Well, if this government wants to wean Tasmania off that sort of federal largesse, that sort of federal assistance, then Canberra should be investing in things in Tasmania that will grow the economy, will help the community, will genuinely create jobs. Things like the $400 million restructure of the University of Tasmania so it can realise its full potential. Things like funding in education in Tasmania. We have a very, very low school retention rate. The state government has just cut pathway planners in the schools, which help kids get into school. You can't grow jobs, you can't grow an economy unless you've got a well-educated population. Deputy Speaker, in closing, I have given the government credit for some good initiatives in this budget. For example, the boost to small business, the boost to childcare, the assistance with Hobart Airport and in other ways. But it's still not fair. It cuts $15 billion over the next 4 years from where it's most needed, helping people most in need. The $80 billion cut to the states over the next 10 years is still in the budget. That is unaffordable. It's not fair. It's not sensibly funded. Tassie doesn't get a fair deal. We're a rich country, Deputy Speaker. We can afford to do it much, much better. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.